Hey guys, Peter Franson here from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. One of my favorite game types is the turn-based, grid-based, just the dungeon, grindy dungeon crawl with a serious visual aesthetic on console. I also want them to have fairly light yet interesting tactical decisions and regular, meaningful upgrades via loot and abilities with a minimum amount of puzzles. Now that's a very specific recipe. Lots of RPGs have one or more of those elements. Very few have all of them. They often mix in wandering around towns and countrysides, finding and talking to villagers to advance quests, collecting monsters, real-time combat, cutesy anime enemies and characters, or other elements outside of the very specific recipe that truly hooks me in. Today, dungeon crawls with all the elements I value are extremely rare. Games on that short list for me include Elmanage Original, Darkest Dungeon, though not quite on target there, Deep Sky Derelicts, and The Bard's Tale 4. It's sadly a very short list, but one filled with games that have hooked me in so deep and given me immensely enjoyable experiences. I held off on buying Labyrinth of Refrain, Coven of Dusk for years because of its anime aesthetic and the character designs, even though I liked much of what I was seeing in the enemy designs and was hearing great things about the gameplay. Gameplay is king for me, but sometimes anime aesthetics can assassinate the king. When the developers of Labyrinth of Refrain recently announced its sequel, Labyrinth of Galeria, The Moon Society, coming in early 2023 to Nintendo Switch and PlayStation, the original game unsurprisingly went on sale on the PlayStation Store for $20, the lowest I've ever seen it. It's still on sale, by the way, through July 6th, 2022, if you're interested. I rolled the dice and bought it, and I've been having a great time. I don't normally review games that have already been out for a while, but there still aren't a ton of reviews for this on YouTube, and none that quite come from my perspective or cover the most important elements to me. So I thought I would give you my reactions after spending over 14 hours in Labyrinth of Refrain, Coven of Dusk, which is a crazy mouthful. But here we go. The main character is a witch that comes to a small village with a labyrinth extending far below it into the earth where no human can survive because of a lethal miasma that fills every corner of it. So the witch employs a self-aware magical book, that's you, to lead soul-infused animated puppets, your adventuring party, through the many layers of the labyrinth to discover its secrets. Now, as far as the story goes, it's mostly told through visual novel-style cutscenes featuring very anime-looking characters that have that stereotypical blend that seems to be going for cute and sexy at the same time that I just recoil from. But I blaze through those scenes mostly just looking at the text, so it's not a big deal to me. And I am mildly interested in where the story will go. The witch, I think her name is Donia, I'll say Donia for this review, is accompanied by a little girl. I'm thinking Luca maybe is her name. I don't know. Like I said, I blaze through this stuff pretty fast. But Donia mistreats this little girl regularly, and it seems played for comedy, but weirdly dips into head-scratching levels of what amounts to child abuse, as Donia recurringly closes her fist and hits Luca. The text actually makes a point of telling you that she closes her fist to hit her. Now, maybe in the original language it reads funnier, but the translated result, like so much of anime to me, just feels weird. Even more weird is a strange nun that, again, in what seems to be intended as a comical fashion, sexually assaults the witch by groping at her in the dark at her home when she stays with this nun as a guest. Thankfully, these kinds of situations are not constant so far, but are noteworthy and recurring elements that have me scratching my head and barreling through scenes all the more quickly. But again, I'm curious what's going to happen to this witch as she tries to navigate getting along with the locals, because she's a very abrasive person. But she's trying to get along with the locals so she can get what she wants from the mysterious well in their town that leads to the labyrinth and all its potential wonders. And there is something cozy and gratifying about the setting as this traveling witch is living out of her caravan cart, and the cutscenes have this oil painting style to their backgrounds that I really appreciate. Now, far less impressive in the visuals are the boring, I suppose some reviewers would say, background tiles as you explore dungeons. Every space of wall and floor is basically identical, but this is to be expected in the genre of grid-based dungeon crawls with a heavy systems focus. So I'm pretty glasses half full when dungeon tiles at least establish a mood and a visual style for the setting. The copy and paste repetition is totally fine by me. Visuals in combat are likewise pretty simple. After selecting actions for everyone, the round plays out in a lightning-fast series of blink and you'll miss them spell and attack animations against enemies that kind of in a flash animation style are moving a little bit, but there's not much going on with them. They do have a nice visual design, but I mean, as far as the animation, there's nothing real special going on here. But I'm fine with that. I'm fine with these lightning-fast animations. This is not like Final Fantasy and many JRPGs that have eye candy spell animations that look cool for a little while, but then eventually simply bog down combat encounters. Now, if controlling puppets in combat sounds lame to you, they actually look like regular adventurers when brought to magical life, although with a definite anime aesthetic. Speaking of which, the character models are definitely not what I would prefer them to be. The female models are almost all objectified, and now and then a cutesy, plush-like version of party members will leap in front of the enemy as part of an attack animation. It's not the vibe I like at all. But the animations are so fast and snappy, and I'm primarily looking at the monsters in combat, because the combat is in that classic Dragon Quest, Dragon Warrior first-person view. So the party member designs are not a real hindrance, and the enemy designs, while including now and then some arguably cute anthropomorphic things like mushrooms, onions, plants, etc., have an almost Tim Burton blend of being darkly whimsical at their brightest and legitimately creepy at other times. So even with several trappings of anime, the visual aesthetics largely work for me and sometimes are a significant plus for me in this experience. That said, I am currently at about 14 hours in a multi-level dungeon filled almost exclusively with cutely designed enemies. And I hope that this is as cute as the game gets. I can't say for sure. Footage I've seen from levels deeper into the game give me reason to think that that may be the case and that I don't have much to worry about. Now, as far as sound and music goes, speaking of Tim Burton, the music feels somewhat inspired by Danny Elfman's Tim Burton film scores. Less stylistically and more philosophically, again blending mirthful cartoon vibes with minor keys and a touch of the sinister. Combat sound effects are snappy and serviceable, even satisfying, despite how quick they come and go. And combined with basic rumble settings for the controller provide a nice quick sense of impact. As for the voice acting, I heard very little, and that was too much for me. I keep it turned off, in and out of combat, all of it. And my leisure time is much improved by the option to do so. I just have almost no tolerance for the unique style that is anime voice acting. But now let's get into the real reason that I play these games, the gameplay, the mechanics. There are numerous tactical elements to consider, including row placement, favored weapons, combat unit groupings, and abilities. Many of these are actually familiar elements that are simply organized a bit differently or given different names. So you may find yourself having a number of aha moments where you say, oh, okay, so this is how healing works, and oh, okay, this is how abilities are assigned, etc. Combat encounters are generally quick and early on are easily doable without understanding any of the game's systems. Those icons, those that refer to system mechanics and the statuses and things, those are all there, and you might think, well, what does that mean? There's a lot going on here in these menus. But don't worry about it. Everything is gradually and progressively explained, sometimes more than once via in-game tutorials, before you ever actually need to have an understanding of those things to leverage them in combat and in exploration. Now, to refresh your memory, there is a manual, but it is sadly only online and not built into the menus of the game itself. Real bummer there. And if you feel intimidated, you do get the option early on in the opening hours to lower the difficulty of dungeons by spending just a little of a magical currency before your next dungeon delve. Combat also moves as fast as you think is the way I would describe these types of games. Some encounters will just involve hitting that auto fight button, and other times you'll slow down and realize, okay, I should think a little before making my choices in this combat encounter. I am a firm believer that turn-based combat gained the unfair reputation of being boring because of well-intentioned but ultimately counterproductive elements that were meant to make it more exciting, like active time battle systems and fantasy attack animations, which ultimately both leave the player waiting for the game. But in turn-based dungeon crawls that understand that it's about the mechanics. I'm never bored because fights are moving exactly as fast or slow as I want them to be every time, and that is perfectly exemplified in my time so far with Labyrinth of Refrain, Coven of Dusk. If combat is the meat now, exploring, I'll say, dungeons is the potatoes, right? Auto mapping makes things easy and satisfying to scratch that checkbox itch. If you're kind of a completionist, then filling out a map in a dungeon like this can be really satisfying. If your philosophy in other RPGs is to make a clean sweep of the dungeon for all possible loot and combat, this is the kind of game to play. You regularly run into sources of magical currency, as well as placed treasure and random treasure as well. I get the constant feeling of acquiring and growing every few steps through the dungeon, and there is always an objective listed in the menu to pursue as well. However, those objectives are not always as fun or as clear as I'd like. That's not super important to me because the meat and potatoes is combat and exploring the dungeon, but even so, objectives are a significant part of how you progress through the game. I've had one random number generator dependent loot acquiring quest so far where I needed to get blank number of this, and they are dropped by enemies based on random dice rolls at the end of combat. But that type of objective hasn't been the norm. Still wasn't great though, because it's not my choice when to try and proceed. A few other times it's been unclear how to proceed because I didn't understand the potential or purpose of some game elements. Sometimes progressing requires dialogue interactions where I have to make choices that go against what seems most reasonable. Other times it was left to me to figure out that an item I found in the dungeon was relevant and useful in a quest objective. It's not quite the same as having to solve abstract puzzles, which I hate, but it's puzzly enough at times to try my patience and have me looking online regularly to just skip the trial and error and get on with the next dungeon area that I'm trying to reach. Now, speaking of pushing deeper into the dungeons, that is a major part of the experience. It's about the management of limited resources like mana, health, restorative potions, as well as broader concerns like, okay, how many of this particular type of consumable do I really need to buy for what I'm likely to encounter in my next run deep into the labyrinth? It's about seeing how far you can push your party and resources before turning back to get a little deeper into the dungeon this time, all the while feeling your capabilities grow in steady increments that make fights easier, allowing you to push further and encounter tougher enemies, and then that cycle just rinses and repeats to my delight. The game gives you all the freedom really to control the difficulty, assuming you enjoy the power increasing grind and that push your luck dungeon dive feeling. And as I play deeper into the first 15 hours, I'm also discovering new tools and options the game provides and explains to make those push your luck dungeon delves more interesting. Of course, for those who dislike the dice roll nature of turn-based combat, it's important to note that the tools and systems the game increasingly introduces and provides are about mitigating luck, giving you ways to prepare and stock up so that when a few combat rolls behind the scenes go bad, you're good to go because you planned ahead. In some ways, it really reminds me of what I enjoyed so much about Monster Hunter World, where my crappy reflex skills had to be compensated for by my thoughtful preparation and leveraging of the systems the game provides. However, unlike Monster Hunter World, Labyrinth of Refrain introduces those systems, I think, at a much more even pace. Instead of feeling overwhelmed when a new tutorial pops up, I'm getting excited because of the new tools I can take advantage of and the new ways I can get what I want out of this experience. As for themes, I'm always looking in the content that I enjoy for moral, philosophical, or spiritual themes that might trigger some worthwhile thought or conversation. I do think it's really interesting and head-scratching in Labyrinth of Refrain that the game tries to make light of things like beating children and what amounts to sexual assault, presenting kind of cartoon versions of these things as though they're merely silly antics of these characters. A little deeper into the game, is an option to purchase a scapegoat that you can lay your sins on in order to lower your karma score and receive the associated mechanical benefits of doing so. And this is a kind of almost a thing you can buy recurringly to bring this about. It's a strange mixing of Judeo-Christian and Eastern religious beliefs, karma being found in Eastern religions and the scapegoat coming straight out of the book of Leviticus. The common thread I'm noticing seems to be that they're, at least in terms of the tone, is that they're playing with serious real-world concepts, but presenting them as weightless and comical. Many reviewers have commented that things take a turn toward the dark in the back half of the game, which makes me wonder if eventually it will attach real weight to some of the ideas that it's playing with, but I think I have a long way to go before I find that out for myself. Though I do suspect it's a long journey that I will enjoy a lot. And we'll certainly keep you guys updated in the Geek Week segment every week on the Christian Geek Central podcast, so stay tuned there for more on my continuing adventures in Labyrinth of Refrain, Coven of Dusk. That's all for now. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.